Hi, my name is Levi Jones, and I would like to talk a little bit about form in preaching or structure. Growing up, I had this kind of idea about preaching where form or structure wasn't very important, and some of that had to do with the ways I thought about the Spirit working in the preaching moment, and that somehow if there was too much structure or form, somehow that would void the work of the Spirit. I've since come to believe that that's not true. In fact, I think the Spirit is more free to work when we've also done the work beforehand and been careful about how we craft our preaching moments and the message. And in fact, any medium of communication that you use uses structure or form. So, for instance, in talking about poetry, there's a particular kind of form that we use that's very different than, say, a newspaper article. And you wouldn't read a newspaper article in the same way that you use a poem, and vice versa. You wouldn't read a poem as you would perhaps the obituary in the newspaper. So form has a very important part in terms of the way that communication is received and understood, and the same is very true for sermons. They can create certain kinds of expectations for what is going to be delivered in a sermon and how to understand it. So one of the forms I would like to talk about is called preaching as celebration. This is a form that I learned this summer in my D-Min program at the Association of Chicago Theological Schools under Dr. Frank Thomas. So I'd like to talk about two books real quick. One of them is Henry Mitchell's Celebration and Experience in Preaching. He is kind of the forerunner in this particular form. Not that he created it, but he also began to, for academic reasons, put it down what is the African American genius in preaching. And so he developed the structure that was then further refined by Dr. Frank Thomas and his book on They Like to Never Quit Praising God, which develops Mitchell's preaching a celebration a little bit further, particularly on the celebration piece. Both of those are excellent books to read, and I would recommend them. So I want to talk a little bit about the form of this particular way of preaching, and it has four parts. There's the situation, there's the complication, there's the resolution, and finally the celebration. The situation would begin the sermon in talking about the situation actually within the biblical text. That's where they suggest you can begin. You can begin in other ways, other situation perhaps, in talking about a situation within your context that then leads you into the biblical text, talking about the situation there. That can be a way to do that. But generally, you need to talk about the situation within the pericope, the text that you're dealing with. So, for instance, right now we're in getting close to Lenten season, but the lectionary is going through the Sermon on the Mount. And so you can talk about Jesus coming out of the desert, the wilderness, having been tempted, and goes up on the mountain to teach. And so you have parallels with Jesus and Moses here teaching the Israelites out in the wilderness. So you have themes of Exodus. Here the disciples are gathered at Jesus' feet, and the crowd is also surrounding Jesus. So you could begin there very easily talking about the situation and why it's important or what's happening to set the stage. Following that, you would then move to the complication. The complication is what is it in the text that is creating tension? What's the problem? What's the difficulty that's happening? So, for instance, in using the Sermon on the Mount, you might talk about the tension between the disciples sitting at Jesus' feet and the crowd that's gathered around Jesus. The disciples have left everything, and the crowd perhaps is just simply looking for the miracle. They're looking for the sign for Jesus to do. But in terms of having developed this kind of discipleship relationship with Jesus, that they haven't gotten there. So you might talk about, this is a sermon for disciples, but not everybody's willing to jump on to the road with Jesus to be a disciple. And the Sermon on the Mount is a really hard thing to begin to live out in our world. It's not easy to live a life as being a meek person, or one who's blessed because they're persecuted for righteousness' sake. Those are not easy things to begin to live out. So that might be the tension that you would develop there. Then you begin to talk about the resolution, and the resolution can be done in a number of different ways again. I think it's always best to begin with the text. What is the text? How is it resolving the tension? And I think Jesus is a good person to begin with in terms of the resolution, but that might not always be the place that you go initially, at least. So if you're preaching out of an Old Testament text, for instance, you might not necessarily jump to Jesus to begin with. You might talk about the way that God makes provision in the wilderness, for instance, when the Israelites are dealing with a shortage of food or water. So how God is a God that provides life even in the most dire circumstances. But generally, our hope is found in God, and God begins to do the resolution. And sometimes that resolution also is some sort of participation with human agents, be it Moses or the Israelite community, or people like even Rahab, who are outsiders to the community. So the situation, the complication, and the resolution. The resolution begins to say, here's the way that God begins to shower grace, or to deliver hope, or challenge even. So here's the resolution. And then from the resolution, we go to the celebration. Now here in the celebration, we're not adding new information. We're not trying to help people just get it in their heads. This is a time to be evocative. This is a time where we begin to try to rewrite the tapes in our conscience, as Dr. Thomas would talk about. And basically that means we've got to get past the head and into the heart. So, one of the ways that you can have moments of celebration is perhaps, and this is something I've done, to sing at the end of a song that people perhaps know, or that they can easily pick up perhaps, that deals with the theme running through the sermon. So this is an opportunity for people to respond joyfully, but also there can be moments where response like lament or repentance can be an appropriate thing. And it can even be a tangible thing. So Dr. Thomas has this wonderful sermon about the Last Supper, and the disciples enter into the upper room, and on the floor in the corner there's the basin, the bowl, and the towel. And the disciples walk past it, not paying attention. But Jesus enters in last, and he sees the basin and the water pitcher and the towel, and begins to serve, and so gives us an example of what it means to be a disciple. And it means following Jesus, who, though being Lord, serves all. So Jesus begins to model the resolution to the complication. And the celebration is that God has been the one who was a servant to us when we least deserved it. So we learn to joyfully serve others. So, perhaps the celebration would be we have actual bowl of water and towel, and we wash each other's feet. So this is finding tangible ways for the community to respond to the message that they've heard. And so there's numerous ways you can do that, but to be creative and evocative in what we're asking people to how to respond. So part of what I want to point out is that our forms matter greatly, and I think this particular form can be really helpful not only for narrative but all sorts of preaching, because it helps us to stay on track, to build tension, to stay closely to the biblical text, and to also to move beyond just doing a cognitive sermon that remains in the head and doesn't touch the heart.